Well, thank you for the opportunity to set the stage actually for our discussions on the UNEP's report on the environmental dimensions of AMR bracing for superbugs. And I'm delighted to be here as David Graham, one of the other co-lead authors of this report, to share some takeaways from our own personal perspectives on the report's findings and the opportunities for civil society action going forward. 2 years in the making, this Global Spotlight report, the culmination of a lot of work, draws perhaps for the first time clearer linkage between the challenges of antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, and the environment. Back in 2017, UNEP flagged AMR as one of the emerging issues of environmental concern in its Frontiers report that year, highlighting particularly the role of water and soil as vectors and reservoirs of AMR, how complex the interactions between humans and animals through the environment are, and how the impact of antimicrobials on the environment too manifests in various ways. A year ago, in February 2022, UNEP released a summary for policymakers that shared with the UNEA Assembly some of the key highlights of the Spotlight report to come. And in February of this year, UNEP launched its Global Spotlight report, Bracing for Superbugs, strengthening environmental action on the One Health response to antimicrobial resistance. Importantly, it acknowledged that while the environmental dimensions of AMR remain complex, there is much that we can still take action on based on the evidence we have today. And as many of you know, some of us have long called for the addition of UNEP to the tripartite agencies of WHO, FAO, and the World Organization for Animal Health. Going back to the process of the UN Interagency Coordination Group on AMR, it was one of the asks I put forward when we presented the IACG recommendations to the UN Secretary General in 2019. And we've called for this repeatedly in briefings and social media in the interval, with UNEP successfully added to form the quadripartite agencies just last year. Now, why does the environment matter in tackling AMR? Taking up the lens of environment of dimensions of AMR serves to broaden the range of ministries and movements to which AMR might find relevance. And among the quadripartite agencies, FAO and WOA, or World Organization for Animal Health, often feel the tug of industry forces in their efforts to work with ministries of agriculture to ensure food security and robust agricultural production. Now, while industry forces also do represent their interests at WHO and UNEP, UNEP brings with it, we hope, an environmental movement that has often been allied with public health interest groups. Environment also serves to bring a unifying lens, a unifying framework to actually addressing the challenge of AMR in different sectors. It wraps around key economic value chains, as we shall detail in a moment. Just last year, the Lancet Graham study, which is the global research on antimicrobial resistance project, estimated that 1.27 million deaths were directly attributed to drug-resistant bacterial infections globally in 2019. To be clear, while we oftentimes use the terms antibiotic or antibacterial resistance interchangeably with antimicrobial resistance, where we mean resistance to a broader range of microbes from viral to fungal infections, the 1.27 million deaths here refers just to drug-resistant bacterial infections. And this was greater than the human toll from HIV/AIDS, breast cancer, or malaria. And 1 in 5 people who died due to AMR were children. As you can see from the regional analysis on the right, the disproportionate number of deaths were in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. You can see the rates of 23.7 per 100,000, 21.5 per 100,000, and the absolute number of deaths, again by region, were in South Asia, 389,000, Southeast and East Asia and Oceania, which were 254,000, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, 255,000. The regional pattern also suggests that AMR burden may not be proportional to consumption of antimicrobials. And from other studies, we know that more patients die today from lack of access to antibiotics compared to those dying from drug-resistant infections. Now, these findings suggest that we need to take more of a systems perspective to find the reasons and the response to addressing AMR burden, and understanding the role of the environment, how AMR is amplified, and how we can be more resilient to the threat of drug-resistant infections might figure importantly in this picture. Now, it's true that the genes conferring drug resistance to bacteria may occur naturally, or they may be acquired, oftentimes where there are environmental stressors, such as climate change, other environmental pollutants like herbicides, or enabling factors like microplastics. While we focus often on antibiotic residues, as when imported food is inspected, what we are most concerned about are drug-resistant pathogens, or bacteria that can cause disease. and also the antibiotic resistant genes that can confer resistance to the drugs that we might use to treat these diseases. Now, when these antibiotic resistant genes or drug resistant pathogens are transmitted through the environment or pool and AMR hotspots, reservoirs in the environment where these AMR related pollutants concentrate, then we should have particular concern. There are important local and global dynamics created by urbanization and globalization that contribute to the spread of AMR. Urban populations are expected to double by 2050 to 2 billion people. And in urban informal settlements are a nexus of drivers of AMR, with population densities upwards of 125,000 persons per square kilometer, living in close proximity with livestock, and inadequate sewage infrastructure. Perhaps unsurprisingly, urban informal settlements may well become hotspots of antimicrobial resistance. And as the boundary of urban areas sprawl into once rural land, zoonotic disease transmission is forcing us to face new infectious disease threats. Globalization refers to people and products moving across borders, from tourists to trade in food products, and this can also spread drug-resistant pathogens. The UNEP report also focuses our attention on several economic value chains, where the activities of those sectors involving antimicrobials warrant particular attention. Notably, these include pharmaceutical manufacturing, and then the two sectors where antimicrobial products are widely consumed, healthcare delivery and food production systems. Now, one of the strategic values of this framing around key economic sectors is that places these value chains within the larger ecosystem perspective from which we must address drivers of AMR. And for each value chain, this perspective asks, what are the inputs and outputs that contribute to AMR? Now, while these value chains typically fall under the scrutiny of other international agencies, the carrying capacity of these value chains is a systemic and environmental concern. Overload a value chain with unnecessary use of antimicrobials, and one might overwhelm the carrying capacity of that value chain. And as a result, spill over antimicrobials, antibiotic-resistant genes, and yes, drug-resistant bacteria into the environment. Now, each of these value chains contribute then to the AMR-related pollution load into the waste stream that our environment and municipal sewage systems must deal with. Now, one would imagine, given the intersectoral reach of AMR, this challenge would be tracked through by the indicators we monitor progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. But till a few years ago, a number of those indicators tracking AMR would have been, the number of indicators that tracking AMR would have been zero. Civil society, some of you will recall, mounted through the Antibiotic Resistance Coalition a successful call for adopting a measure to track antimicrobial stewardship put forward by WHO over quite a few other competing measures. And at the same time, we also called for one on access, forged from repurposing existing indicators. And eventually, this was in fact done. These measures, though, were limited to the healthcare delivery system. However, SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, or sustainable consumption and production, provides a core organizing focus for the environmental dimensions of AMR. Such a framing requires understanding, one, the drivers of production and consumption, secondly, the patterns of production and consumption, and third, prioritizing where in the life cycle production and consumption is the most impact on society and environment. And in this construct, as we can see in the diagram on the right, SDG 12 can powerfully organize how AMR impacts the other SDGs. SDG 12 addresses inputs and outputs to the key economic value chains and their discharge into the environment. SDG 2 for zero hunger related food systems. SDG 3, good health and the well-being. SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. SDG 12 also feeds into the triple planetary crisis: pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change. Again, SDG 6, SDG 11, and 13, which in turn impacts life below water, SDG 14, and life on land, SDG 15. And this, of course, turns into, of course, economic impacts. The impact on human lives and livelihoods are manifested through the economic impacts of AMR on SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, as AMR could push an additional 24 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. Or, of course, SDG 5, gender equality, whereby the risk factors such as prevalence of smallholder farmers or the treatments of antibiotic treatable diseases may differ by gender. Not surprisingly, this distills down into how it impacts SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, with anticipated shortfall of $3.4 trillion by 2030 if things don't change. And through partnerships for the goals, which is of course SDG 17, perhaps we could put government regulation to work and make markets more responsive to sustainable procurement of food animal products raised without the routine use of antimicrobials. Let's take the value chains, though, each in turn. Upstream in the value chain of antimicrobials, we have pharmaceutical manufacturing. The very process of manufacturing these drugs also can result in discharge of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, into the environment, sometimes directly into the environment and other times into the municipal waste stream. Though governments may regulate pharmaceutical discharge more generally, none to our knowledge does so specifically for antibiotics. The industry trade group, though, the AMR Industry Alliance, has put forward an antibiotic manufacturing standard in which it has laid out discharge levels that they believe will have no predicted effect, or PNECs, predicted no effect concentrations. These discharge levels that differ by antibacterial product are based on still evolving science that purport to address two goals: not pose ecotoxicological effect and not induce resistance in bacteria. And imperfect as the starting point may be, they do represent targets against which the 20 or so antibiotic manufacturing members of the AMR Industry Alliance, and that's, by the way, against the membership of over 100 companies, have strived to attain in their own manufacturing sites. Now, the AMR benchmark put out by the Access to Medicines Foundation tracks a different but overlapping set of research-based and generic antibiotic manufacturers. And one of the more important insights is that most of the manufacturing sites are operated by suppliers contracted by the drug manufacturers, and the reach of the manufacturers to ensure compliance by their own suppliers to PNEC discharge limits is even more limited. The strategic question for civil society has been whether and how can pharmaceutical manufacturers do a better job of reducing AMR-related pollution. Improving supply chain transparency would be an important start. And some have also suggested conditioning procurement and reimbursement systems for these drugs on environmentally sound manufacturing practices. There has been, however, a policy tension, even within civil society, between more stringent enforcement of such practices that might be more costly and challenging for low-cost generic antibiotic suppliers to meet, and helping to keep more affordable sources of these antibiotics sustainable. So much of what is manufactured by the drug companies flows into the healthcare delivery system, including the latest and greatest antibiotics. In this value chain, healthcare facilities like hospitals may have a role to play. And as groups like Healthcare Without Harm have shown, these institutions can support system change in the way they procure goods as well as treat hospital discharge. Communities also dispose expired antibiotics into the municipal waste stream. And as the diagram on the right-hand suggests, we can intervene at different points along the value chain, from pharmaceutical manufacturing to the healthcare delivery system. But various factors come into play. Where does antimicrobial discharge have the greatest likelihood of inducing antibiotic-resistant genes that might result in drug-resistant pathogens? How easily can AMR-related transmission spread to humans and animals? And what are the costs of treating at different points in the value chain, the pharmaceutical manufacturer, the hospital or healthcare facility, and the municipal waste treatment plant? COVID-19 and, once again, polio have rekindled interest in wastewater surveillance as a way of tracking disease in communities. For AMR surveillance, building upon this interest, particularly as the pandemic instrument is negotiated in Geneva, might be a strategic opportunity to support at least maintaining, if not expanding, wastewater surveillance efforts. Now, nearly 3/4 of the antimicrobials sold globally are intended for use in food animal production, as opposed to human medicine. And a handful of countries are responsible for a disproportionate share of this consumption. The same classes of antibiotics used in human medicine are often used in food animals and crop production. So the drug resistance that develops from their application in the food system can cross over to their use in human medicine. Antibiotics are necessary to ensure the treatment of diseased animals, but too often are being used routinely to prevent disease, in part resulting from conditions of overcrowding, and high-density growing conditions. The World Organization for Animal Health notes that a quarter of countries reported use of antimicrobials for growth promotion. And by that, we mean that antibiotics were not used to treat disease in animals, but instead to improve growth of animals, improve feed efficiency, to offset poor hygienic conditions, or to fatten animals faster. We need such data to be transparent, but the World Organization for Animal Health masks the country-level data on antimicrobial consumption in food production in its public reporting, out of concern that public reporting might jeopardize countries actually voluntarily putting this information into their reporting system. Now, antibiotics are also used in crop production. CABI, an intergovernmental agency supporting plant management, studied recommendations made by crop advisors in 32 countries and found that a third recommended antibiotic use for crop protection as standard practice. And with globalization, of course, these food products readily cross borders in international trade. So one might wonder, how do drug-resistant infections in the food system show up in human medicine? 600 million cases of foodborne diseases and 420,000 deaths resulting. This is a WHO statistic to which many of us can relate. While some of these are bacterial, both bacterial and viral presentations of foodborne illness may prompt overuse of antibiotics. And there has been a growing appreciation of drug-resistant foodborne disease outbreaks, from the 10,000 afflicted with extensively drug-resistant typhoid in Pakistan in recent years, to a recent survey of pork sampled in UK supermarkets that found 10% carried vancomycin-resistant enterococci, a superbug found in wound and urinary tract infections. Those who argue it's just a matter of cooking food the right way should tell that to the 600 million patients who came down with foodborne diseases. Of note, though, is not just diarrheal and gastrointestinal diseases. A few years back, a research study found that urinary tract infections also could be traced directly to a drug-resistant form of E. coli in retail poultry meat, chicken off your grocery store shelves. And resistance to one of our last-line antibiotics in human medicine, colistin, emerged in China, where this genetic determinant of drug resistance was found in food animals, raw meat, and patients hospitalized with diagnosed infection. The antibiotic was seldom used in human medicine, but too often in food animal production. Of the environmental dimensions of AMR, the linkage with climate change has stirred great interest. As climate change worsens, the incidence of infectious diseases might increase, even migrate to new geographies, and antimicrobial use may rise as well. Extreme weather patterns we have begun to see will become more common, disrupting the natural environment and contributing to the emergence and spread of AMR. And these weather changes will put greater pressure on food production systems, which in turn will become more reliant on increased use of antimicrobials. But is AMR just one more consequence of climate change to mitigate? If so, we may be standing in an increasingly long line of consequences we are trying to avert, from the submerging of coastal cities and island countries to a widening belt of drought-stricken agricultural economies. Might the causal arrow flow in the other direction as well? Might the use of antimicrobials contribute to climate change? And of the various ways to keep temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, agriculture is considered potentially a major contributor. We may not have definitive science to back this yet, but a study in 2016 looked at the effect of a 3-day course in cattle tetracycline, an antibiotic also used to treat infections in humans, and found that it increased methane gas emissions in the manure. Treated cattle produced 1.8 times more methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Now, why might this be important? It turns out that livestock emissions account for roughly 32% of human-caused methane emissions. So if treating livestock with antibiotics contributes to anywhere close to 1.8 times more methane gas emissions, figuring that out could be a game changer. Should we be looking at these causal linkages that might place the use of antimicrobials much closer to the front of the line in the fight to slow climate change? The emerging scientific literature also raises other intriguing findings from studies that warrant further investigation and replication. Herbicides like glyphosate or Roundup, 2,4-D, and dicamba can affect the tolerance to antibiotics. Now, while it can go in either direction, worrisomely, it can induce greater drug resistance in enteric bacteria like E. coli. And taking these findings from lab to field studies, another study found that several herbicides promoted the movement of antibiotic-resistant genes between bacteria. And this pattern of herbicide exposure and increased antibiotic-resistant genes was found in agricultural soils taken from across 11 provinces in China. AMR also intersects with another major environmental pollutant. Microplastics are nearly ubiquitous, it would seem, in our environment. And as recent studies from the Netherlands confirm, microplastics have been found in 3/4 of meat and milk products tested, and even the blood of farm animals. What has not been as widely reported, though, is that microplastics form biofilms on their surface, and which can increase by 100-fold the uptake of genetic exchange of drug-resistant determinants. And that's just drug-resistant genetic determinants. Now, in both of these examples, the science is early, and the findings suggest that we need to learn much more about how these different environmental contaminants might amplify antibiotic resistance. Now, despite these findings of AMR and the environment, global health financing to tackle this challenge has not followed. So why, with this increased policymaker awareness of emerging infectious disease like COVID-19, have we spent trillions of dollars responding to the pandemic? But the multi-party trust fund on AMR, after over 3 years of operation, has only raised in the ballpark of $26 million, and maybe even less on their website. Honestly, I cannot think of a good reason. Even before the pandemic, the World Bank projected that if AMR goes unchecked, up to 24 million more people could be forced into extreme poverty by 2030. It looks like COVID-19 might have beaten AMR to the punch there. But under the AMR, high impact AMR scenario, this could amount to a 3.8% loss of annual GDP by 2050 and an annual shortfall of $3.4 trillion by 2030. The bank has concluded that putting resources in AMR containment now is one of the highest yield investments countries can make. By investing just $9 billion a year in low and middle income countries, we could avert trillions of dollars of potential economic losses. Significant returns on this investment would accrue to low and middle income countries, but over 80% of these returns, as illustrated on the pie chart on the right, would benefit upper middle and high income countries, the very countries that would be best positioned to make this global investment. Part of our challenge will be to make the case for investing to address AMR. As we've seen over 5 years ago, the World Bank helped us to lay out the case for this, laying out the potential economic toll if AMR went unchecked. And in 2022, the Lancet Graham study documented the human toll just from bacterial AMR at levels much higher than previously estimated. COVID-19 has taught us what a global pandemic could cost, telescoping the toll of what might have taken a decade to witness into a few years. And as the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, or INB, works to lay down the framework for a pandemic instrument, we must not miss the opportunity to tackle AMR alongside other future emerging diseases. There would be synergy in tracking zoonotic disease transmission, building an integrated surveillance system, reinforcing infection prevention control measures in our healthcare delivery system, and preparing surge capacity for delivering new drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines. The UNEP report, Bracing for Superbugs, takes us a step further by finding deeper connection between the environment and AMR. In extending the reach of AMR to the economic value chains of pharmaceutical manufacturing, the healthcare delivery system, and the food system, and importantly to the municipal and community waste streams around them, it is timely to consider what co-benefits might come from treating pharmaceutical waste from hospitals to making food production more sustainable. A couple of years ago, FAO, UNDP, and UNEP released the report on the right-hand side of this slide, a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, repurposing agricultural support to transform food systems. In it, they conclude that nearly 90% of the $450 billion in global farm subsidies each year were in some ways harmful to health, the environment, climate, as well as worsening inequality by excluding smallholder farmers. We should look to see if we might repurpose such financing and find co-benefits as we look to invest in efforts to tackle AMR. And in so doing, as we will explore over the next couple of days, we surely will uncover how and where we might find collective action in connection with other civil society movements. Over the years, since its founding in 2014, nearly a decade ago, the Antibiotic Resistance Coalition has time and again found that there is strength in drawing such connections across civil society. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of these starter reflections on the environmental dimensions of AMR.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for that very clear presentation. I'd first like to invite our participants to address any specific questions you may have to Anthony with regards to the presentation. We have up to 10 minutes for this segment. So just make sure if you can be precise on the question. And of course, if that sparks a dialogue for the moment, that's a great way to start us off, and we can continue that through the chat as we go through the sessions. As noted, if you prefer your question or your comments not to be recorded, just please let us know when you start to speak and we'll just pause the recording. Yes, I see request for the hand from Yokeling. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Viviana. Yokeling here from Third World Network. Many thanks, Anthony. That was, as usual, a brilliant overview introduction. I just wanted to pick up on one of the points of action you had towards the end, that the kind of response to COVID-19, the need to be more prepared, etc. And yet, when we look at the data and and this UNEP report and many of the things you pointed out tonight reinforces that AMR is actually so deadly and so systemic, right? So maybe you could give us a few more thoughts about how we could actually use the momentum of responding to pandemics to be able to build a new momentum for AMR. Thanks.
That's a great question. And one I think that probably for the last few years, many of us, of course, have thought deeply about, because all of us, of course, were suffering from the pandemic and trying to imagine what the world might be if we could avoid actually a follow-on such effort that was so inequitable and so in many ways in its response. And so in many ways, we look for a road actually out of this pandemic that actually would be more equitable than the one that we took into this pandemic. So there are a number of course, I would say areas of potential actually entry. And I would say that particularly with the pandemic instrument being negotiated now, this is the most timely period for us to actually consider this. One will be in the area of integrated disease surveillance. Now, clearly there is within even AMR and the quadripartite agency some effort to bring together that. But interestingly, we've not taken advantage of the infrastructure that's been built. As the polio virus, for example, lab surveillance system was being transitioned before the pandemic out of actually future needs. So they actually were literally setting aside that infrastructure. But then, of course, during COVID-19, we found that particularly in the World Health Assembly reports that updated, of course, the status of the polio virus system, that they had to draw back in a lot, of course, of the infrastructure they needed for COVID-19 surveillance efforts. And we've also seen polio virus also being again, what's actually surfacing, and even in industrialized country, actually monitoring of waterways. So this is a great moment actually to bring together the call for AMR sewage surveillance, which has been done actually in the last few years, to be coupled with the polio virus and the COVID-19 surveillance. And this is just a great example of where actually we shouldn't let that infrastructure that took years to build to get the community buy-in to take those samples and actually report them to a global system, and actually protect that and actually build on that base so that actually we can put in new diagnostic approaches for the same kind of sampling actually networks to actually do more to spot emerging infectious diseases. So that and other areas like infection prevention and control, the surge capacity certainly for actually diagnostic drugs and vaccines, these all require also the same kind of consideration of what types of actually institutional structures we need to create for an end-to-end approach for diseases. And you can see that in a number of places, such as we were doing for the WHO Fair Pricing Forum in 2021, we try to put together some of the architecture for that. And I hope that we'll pick up some of these things, because we certainly can do a better job when the next emerging infectious disease comes before the world.
Thanks, Anthony. We have another request for the floor from Musa Munienda. If you could also introduce yourself, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Nice presentation by Anthony. I've got one question. How much support drug manufacturing companies putting in terms of surveillance efforts, monitoring of the AMR problem? Because I think the drug companies, the manufacturers, they have a role to play, but in most of the activities, I don't see the drug manufacturing company coming out very clearly. What is their role? How much support have they given in terms of surveillance as well as monitoring? Thank you.
That's a great question, and it's there actually it's quite a complicated one too. It depends on which part of actually the pharmaceutical value chain one is, of course, asking about. In pharmaceutical manufacturing, of course, there are, as I was pointing out, these standards which have been set up really by the AMR Industry Alliance. To their credit, they have tried to set some targets for which actually a very limited number, of course, of manufacturers or antibiotic manufacturers have subscribed to, largely for their own manufacturing facilities and with less ability to actually control their many suppliers that supply them. So it's a start, but it's obviously not a substitute for governmental regulation that probably needs to follow. And importantly, we need to think about the dynamics of actually how much effort we should put into, of course, enforcing environmental regulations at the manufacturing stage, and whether it's worth the effort and what's the trade-off against, of course, potentially disrupting fragile supply chains, particularly from generic low-cost antibiotic suppliers. And this has led to some tension between the big multinational suppliers actually and those which are more generic, manufacturers. And so again, I think we're going to have to work that out because there's clearly a tension in some ways. And I think David Graham in the next talk will probably speak a little bit more about actually where one makes those kind of decision points and what type of cost benefit is involved. Now, going downstream is interesting because, with Wellcome Trust support, there have been efforts to aggregate pharmaceutical industry supported actually networks for surveillance more at the hospital level. And some of us actually would say there are some important questions to be asked, like, do they do surveillance largely in hospitals which have high intensity use of antibiotics or frequent visits by detailed people from pharmaceutical salespersons who are actually advancing the use of antibiotics or other drugs in those same facilities? And does that lead to a bias potentially in the level of resistance one sees in, quote, the community that's being surveyed by, of course, the surveillance networks? So we don't know whether we should want them to actually be involved per se in actually providing us that system, certainly not as a substitute to actually a broader public health surveillance system that might be less biased, potentially in sampling design, so that we actually get a better sense of actually what the real community levels of resistance are. But they are doing obviously some work in that area. The tricky part is actually when they're also involved in those setting actually the criteria by which actually antibiotics are considered to be resistant or not. So they actually are involved in things like the CLSI, or the Clinical Laboratory Standards Institute's setting of antimicrobial susceptibility breakpoints in the past. I understand they've tried to make changes in the conflict of interest after a number of us complained that 10 out of 14 members of their committee actually determining this were either pharmaceutical company employees or actually supported on their research by the pharmaceutical industry. And so, this has led to concerns because, like a study at Hopkins found, that if you change the antimicrobial susceptibility criteria, like for ceftriaxone, a very important cephalosporin antibiotic in children, actually you would essentially the change actually in the behavior based on that criterion shift would have been actually 0 in terms of mortality, but you would have a 300% increase actually in the use of second-line antibiotics. So these are the kinds of concerns, obviously, where we want to make sure that where they are involved in surveillance is done in a way that is without conflict of interest, and that is actually truly objective by scientific evidence. So I hope that's helpful in actually unpacking this pretty complicated issue, but very important question.
Listen, I think that will definitely be an issue we'll keep on touching upon generally of how do we engage with private sector actors and potential sources of tension here. We will be moving on and now just on this first presentation, but do feel free to use the chat to add any other thoughts or takeaways that others you might wish to point to on the general issue of how do we lift up environmental dimensions of antimicrobial resistance. With this, I thank Anthony again, and we will now continue with the presentation by David Graham. And David, thank you for being with us. You can share your screen.
I'm about to do that.
And David, I'll let you introduce your presentation as well. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Viviana, and also thank you, Anthony, for a great overview. As Anthony said, I was one of the co-lead authors on the UNEP report that came out, and the part of that report I was particularly involved in was trying to characterize transmission of spread of AMR in the environment. And my background is actually that of a water engineer, although I've got a background in genetics and biochemistry as well. So I've got kind of an unusual perspective in the sense that I look at AMR and the environment and solutions to AMR in a broader sense from a somewhat engineering focused or solution-based perspective. And as a consequence, the presentation I'm going to give, actually, there are some overlaps with what Anthony said, but I'm more interested in some general technological details that are important for civil society organizations and others to understand where and why things are different in different parts of the world and how solutions in different parts of the world are going to be different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off, and this sounds like a university lecture, I'm going to start off in talking about what AMR actually is, why it occurs, and what we care about it and why. Now, for some of you, this is going to be stuff you've known for 20 years, but some of it is a bit different. And I think you've got to think about AMR and the organisms that become resistant in a somewhat different way when you start thinking about them as something that's passing through the environment, possibly causing spread towards humans and other animals. So what basically an AMR microorganism, whether it's a bacteria or a fungus or whatever, it's an organism that we have made slightly stronger by the fact that we've exposed those organisms to chemicals, sometimes some of which we call antibiotics, but it can be other chemicals like Anthony said. Basically, what we've done is we've caused organisms to become stressed. When an organism becomes stressed, it starts rearranging its genes. And that rearrangement process occasionally will end up with an organism that's stronger. The organisms that don't successfully rearrange their genes die, and they're the ones that are susceptible. So what happens is, as we expose microorganisms across the globe to potentially stress-causing agents like antimicrobials, we're making slightly stronger bacteria in the background. They are competing more successfully relative to organisms that don't carry resistance. And the consequence of that is that you have a stronger pool that's competing and succeeding. Now, the reason why this has become such a horrifically difficult problem and why the environment is so important is this is happening simultaneously. Wherever we are polluting the environment or using antibiotics, antimicrobials for use, it can happen in medicine, in the gut of a treated human, in veterinary medicine, the gut of a treated animal. It can happen in land associated with crops, or it can happen in water where you're releasing human fecal wastes that haven't been adequately treated. So it's happening literally everywhere all the time. And part of the reason why we've been so unsuccessful until the last 3 or 4 years, and the UNEP report is a definition of our success, is that it's been really difficult to try and put a smoking gun on the environmental pathways and connections between one sector and another. So one of the great successes of the report, I think, is the fact that it's really driven thinking towards AMR from a tripartite perspective to a quadripartite perspective, and a One Health view towards addressing the problem of AMR. Basically, it says that humans, animals, plants, and the environment are so closely interlinked that if we have AMR within any one of those 4 pools, it will pollute or cross-contaminate AMR in the other pools. And this has got a very important consequence relative to solutions, because we could fix AMR in human and animal medicine, but if we don't deal with the environment, it will just pollute the systems that we've cleaned up. And it's true with any of the sectors. So any solution we create, and this is central to the messages provided in the UNEP report, is that we must have holistic solutions across all the sectors, or we will probably not solve the problem. So I'm only going to highlight a few examples. Anthony's talk was much broader brush, but I'm only really going to talk about a few examples. I'm going to highlight the issue of human waste and antibiotics and water sanitation and hygiene. And I'm going to use that to show how different developing and developed countries are relative to the impact of AMR and potentially explain to you why. Then I'll talk about 2 of the 3 value chains that Anthony highlighted, which is one is healthcare and the other is pharmaceuticals. I'm not going to talk about agriculture and food because it's going to be discussed later by other people. But what I'm really going to do is only highlight some examples to show you how and why certain points in our global experience we must be aware of relative to preventing AMR. And one of there are three major conclusions from the UNEP report. One is that the best way to solve AMR is to prevent it from happening in the first place. The second is we don't really know exactly what is causing what. And so we have to come up with a better way of integrated surveillance of AMR and infectious disease in general terms in the environment. And then through that, we can come up with the appropriate barriers and One Health-based solutions that we can have to try and reduce AMR spread and the environmental mediation of AMR. So before I go into the specific cases, and I'm going to look at 3 cases, I want to make sure, and Anthony already mentioned this, but I really want to highlight something of importance relative to prioritization. The question is, what do we want to prevent and what do we want to perform surveillance on? And as Anthony said, the principal immediate concern that we've got is antimicrobial resistant pathogens. They're basically disease-causing organisms, whether it's in humans, animals, or crops, that cause our therapeutic responses to not work. But that's not the only place where we find resistance. Because of the fact that we've used chemicals and pollute the environment in other ways, other organisms that aren't pathogenic but just reside in the environment are also drug resistant. So it's these non-drug resistant environmental and commensal strains that actually can be the pool from which pathogens can harvest the potential for resistance. And this pool is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger as we pollute the environment. Now, what those resistant organisms, whether they're pathogenic or not, are actually doing is they're acquiring, or through mutations, gaining resistance genes, or what are called mobile elements that allow organisms to share genes. They're accumulating those elements and genes. Now, a key thing, and this is something that many don't realize, is that the resistance genes for us, for somebody like me who does environmental surveillance, are just indicators for the potential for resistance. The fact that you find a gene somewhere doesn't necessarily mean you find resistance. And that's, so it's an indicator. All it is an indicator. And what we're working towards, and this is one of the knowledge gaps, is connecting those genes and mobile elements to specific resistant pathogens. However, we're not there yet. However, the UNET report discusses the relationship between pathogens, commensals, and the genes that can potentially make them resistant in some detail. And finally, there's the chemicals themselves. And the chemicals are possibly the trickiest one to talk about, because antimicrobials' effect on the relative strengthening or empowering of bacteria to become resistant really depends upon the relative exposure concentration, exposure environment. In my own experience, the predominance of resistance development and transmission occurs actually in the gut of the treated host. But we know antimicrobials are released out into the environment, albeit in a much lower concentration and dilute way. And we also know that there's recruitment of resistance from the environment that has nothing to do with the therapeutic use. So the question is the antimicrobial, so you have to think about the antimicrobial in the sense that in an environmental sense, it's more an indicator of the prevalence of the potential for resistance. But the key is how really it creates a resistant pathogen or a resistant commensal strain is very much concentration dependent. Now, within this context, I'm going to talk about domestic waste, and then I'm going to talk about healthcare, and then I'm going to talk very briefly about manufacturing. And in the middle of that presentation, I'm going to talk about some specific technical reasons why developing countries and developed countries are quite different in terms of how we develop solutions. So when it comes to domestic waste, the reason why we have AMR in domestic waste and fecal solids is because we use antibiotics. The resistant organisms go out on our fecal matter, and if we don't treat that fecal matter in an appropriate manner, it goes out into the environment, polluting and creating potential for resistance transmission once those wastes have mixed with other organisms in the environment. So when it comes to waste management and solutions, and these are principal guidance results of the UNEP report is we must increase wastewater and waste containment and optimize wastewater treatment and management processes. Now, what the word optimize is doesn't mean use the most expensive option. What we want to do is recognize the fact that we have to come up with the best possible solution for each scenario. And what I'm going to explain to you over the next 4 or 5 minutes is why the optimization means something quite different from place to place. In a developed country, it might be where you've got wastewater treatment and civil infrastructure in high levels, you innovate, adapt, and retrofit existing systems. However, when we're dealing with resource limited settings, we must reconsider what's needed to try and solve the problem, because some of this basics infrastructure that's prevalent in developed countries aren't necessarily as well developed in low resource settings. And so what we want to do is identify the best buys available for each scenario to reduce the probable spread of AMR from that source. So if this is my map, and it basically shows you 3 sources on the left, which are healthcare facilities, domestic sources, non-related to healthcare, and manufacturing, which was a bit different. And I'll talk about that later. But basically in this, it shows you the nature of how we handle our wastes. And in fact, how we handle our waste and what happens depends very much on resource setting. So if we look at the lower left corner, we have open defecation, which is basically no prevention. Basically, the fecal matter that comes out of an individual runs off and goes into whatever environment's exposing it to, maybe a river. So the first level of prevention we have is just providing safe sanitation, providing fully implemented wash. And in fact, it's, as you will see, it's actually the most cost-effective way of addressing AMR in the first instance. Basically, you want to take the fecal matter that's laden with AMR, and you want to put a barrier between it and going to the wider environment. Now, if you're lucky enough to have infrastructure that's safe, that's well managed, you then put in treatment, which is first primary treatment, which is settling out solids, secondary treatment, which is carbon removal, and tertiary treatment, which is removing extra nutrients and other components. The problem with that, those technologies we have work very well. They're not perfect, but they're really good. And the parts of the world where you find primary, secondary treatment, and to some extent tertiary, are the places that have got the lowest level of AMR. And that basically tells me that this pathway, this environmental fact of how we treat our waste and manage our waste, must be central to the AMR problem on a global scale. The problem is most of the world, or much of the world, probably over half of the world, doesn't have a civil infrastructure. In other words, it doesn't have a reliable system with sewer lines that are well developed, that don't leak, and are well managed. And as a consequence, many parts of the world have got this infrastructural barrier to put in the types of treatment technologies that will actually help them reduce the AMR spread through waste. Now, the key thing, though, is, and this is critical for coming up with best buys, is if you look at the figure on the left, if you look at fecal matter, which is my bar on the far left, and this was sort of a desk-based study we did a few years ago. We were trying to say, well, what is the relative incremental value of just putting in safe sanitation, putting in primary treatment, putting in secondary treatment, putting in tertiary treatment? And what you can see is the greatest incremental value was actually just initially the containment step. The treatment step reduces AMR progressively, but the incremental value of those progressive steps is actually comparatively small than just containing the waste in the first place, the fecal matter in the worst place. If you look at the figure on, so that what that basically says is that fully implemented water sanitation and hygiene is absolutely critical in places where you don't have infrastructure. Now, this figure on the right is, once again, it's more of a cost assessment in a thought basis. The key then, from what you can see from my previous figure, is infrastructure is really important. If you don't have physical infrastructure, sewer pipes that can take waste to a place where you can treat it to a higher level, then your solutions actually lie on the left side of this barrier. And the reason is the cost of the infrastructure in any wastewater network is probably 10 to 20 times more than the cost of the whole system combined. And it's because you got to bury pipes in the ground. It's really expensive. So if you don't have this infrastructure, which is this problem in many developing countries, what do? Well, what you do is you focus on improved sanitation. You look at primary treatment and you look at decentralized treatment that doesn't require infrastructure. If you've got infrastructure, then you want to try and develop those further technologies, but you've got to overcome that infrastructural barrier. And the definition of what your best buy is depends upon whether there's civil infrastructure or not in a particular place. So before I talk about hospitals, I want to, because I've just given you a technical description of what's happening with wastewater, I want to talk about hospital waste and why they're different. And then I'll talk a little bit about healthcare and hospital waste from the perspective of a source of AMR and how and why they should be handled differently in a developed versus developing environment. So once again, healthcare waste is basically human fecal matter, chemicals. The difference between a hospital or healthcare facility and human and waste that are taken in that come out of the community is the types of drugs that are used. They tend to be more powerful, and the type of bacteria that you have released. And the key difference between what comes out of a hospital, everything I've said to do with human waste from the community applies. The difference is that hospital waste have got much, much higher levels of organisms that are carrying genes that are genetically mobile. So they're organisms that are more likely to, once they get in the environment, that they're more likely to share their genes with other organisms, and you're going to have much higher levels of potential exchange and development of new resistance. Also, you have higher levels of diversity of resistance coming from hospitals. And these 2 points are absolutely crucial when you think of the developed versus developing country question, because if you have a hospital in a developing country and you don't have this treatment infrastructure, then the healthcare waste goes directly into the water or the environment where people reside. And you've got what amounts to being the worst case scenario, fecal matter, being directly exposed to individuals. And in fact, the work we've done, particularly in Southeast Asia, we found that the highest level of resistance we find is in poor communities that are in the vicinity of hospitals. And we think it's directly attributable to the fact that the hospital wastes are so much worse than traditional or routine domestic waste. So when you think about the hospital question, well, we should consider AMR targeted on-site treatment of hospital waste. It's especially critical if you're in a low resource setting. Now, obviously, because you've got a low resource setting, there's a limited number of resources. But if you want to try and put your finger on a particular place that requires the greater level of treatment, that's where you should focus. You need to be much more conscious of how you dispose of the waste. They don't go down the toilet, they go through some sort of incineration process. But ultimately, you want to reduce the amount of AMR in general senses. So if you prevent AMR from forming, the fact that that there's a much less influence it's going to have in the environment. The problem is that once it gets into the environment, it then becomes mobile. And once it becomes mobile, i.e. in water, then it can transmit and move everywhere. So the final point, and then I'll stop, is just talking about manufacturing. I'm not going to talk about it as much because I know Anthony did talk about it a bit, but I want to prioritize the ways you go about dealing with manufacturing waste. And a lot of people have thought about, okay, you take the waste and you just treat the waste coming from the manufacturing facility to some defined standard. But that actually is kind of a backward way of looking at how you deal with waste. It's very different than what we do in most scenarios. What you really want to do is prevent the possibility of AMR coming from or antimicrobials coming from a facility. And how you do that is by engineering the actual process itself better. You want to green engineer the process. You want to minimize the waste. You want to and you want to only treat or potentially release waste which are efficiently treatable. And I can explain that in more detail if people are interested in. We do need standards, but I think there's a lot of debate about what standards they should be. I feel they should be legally defendable standards, and I think some of the standards that are being promulgated right now are probably not legally defendable And I think we need more information. We want to promote technologies that reduce AMR rather than create it, and that's a big problem. And we want to increase surveillance near manufacturing facilities. And finally, if you think about it in general sense, if you take your manufacturing facility and you remove an infrastructure, you once again have got the same problem in a developing country versus a developed country. In other words, there's no real line of defense relative to potentially wider exposure. So what we want to do, especially in developing country scenarios, we want to engineer manufacturing processes that reduce, segregate, and treat waste at source in the most efficient, best buy way. You want to reduce the amount of consumption such that there's fewer agents demanded upon. And then if you actually have an end-to-point solution, you want to have it come out of a green process where there's only a small fraction that's really going to be impacted by antimicrobials. So in conclusion, we need, I think the UN report has been really successful in terms of increasing the awareness of the problem, the role of the environment as a mediator for spread and transmission, but it also tells us that we have to improve how we monitor and perform surveillance. And the only reason why we will be able to prioritize which of all those mosaic of potential solutions we should address is if we actually know where the waste, where the AMR is coming from, where it's developing, and where we can prevent it from exposure. We must look at best buys for wastewater management rather than the most most expensive option, and we must promote global WASH. We have to work towards standards, but we're a little ways from that, and we want to have AMR in the environment embedded within every national action plan in the world. So with that said, I thank you for your attention. I'll answer questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, David. And for participants, do take note that in David's presentation, he has included his email. We have gotten some requests already for that. So definitely a lot of interest in your presentation. Thank you for being so clear, though, covering a wide range of scope of issues. And I think it's for the range of participants we have in this session, it's really important, as you said, to really consider the local context, both in terms of capabilities and, what are the stakeholders. I will check first before taking too much of the time now. If you'd like to ask any questions, please just raise your hand. While I wait for hands, I'll just ask David, if you could just tell us, following the mention you've said that, at the core, improving sanitation is an essential action that must be taken in countries. Could you tell us a little bit more about what kind of WASH interventions do you think would be best buys? I mean, we do see from a recent WHO report that WASH continues to be quite deficient in many countries. And there's a number of suggestions of, how to improve. What would you suggest in the context of AMR? What might be best buys?
Okay, I'll go from the minimalist to slightly more maximum solutions. The minimal thing is you want to not have exposure to other people's fecal matter. That's the most important point. So if you've in the aspirations of a fully implemented WASH is you have barriers between where you're actually, the one person is defecating and the consequence of somebody else's waste is potentially going to expose somebody else. So if you've got a pit latrine, you have barriers. The pit latrine body is above the groundwater table. However, and these are sort of fundamental common sense things. So the less exposure you have fecal matter, the better. The next level is, okay, what is a best buy? Okay, I'll give you an example. We've been working in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa, and they have come up with what I think is a rather good idea. It's an idea that we've been espousing for about 10 years, and I don't think they're taking it up because we've been espousing the idea, but I think they've recognized the importance of an intelligent solution. One of the problems with Addis is it's got a fragmented sewer system. It's got sewers, but they're not fully connected across the whole city. So what they're doing is they're building wastewater treatments, smaller ones, in the vicinity of sewers that are well managed. So what you do is, rather than trying to connect all the system together, which is going to be really expensive, what they're going to do is rely on putting sensible treatment plants that use less energy, which is another thing we can potentially promote through better waste treatment, that are more suited to reduce resistance and infectious disease spread. So what this amounts to being is decentralization. One of the central rules, and this is sort of a question you didn't ask, in wastewater engineering, is you always want to treat your waste, whatever it happens to be, whether it's AMR or something else, when the waste is most concentrated in a small volume, because that's going to make it cheaper. The kinetics, the thermodynamics of the treatment process are going to be better. So so when you deal with a source, this is where surveillance is important. If you got a particular source that you know is a serious source, say of AMR spread, you want to treat that as close to the place where the source is as possible, because the concentrations are going to be higher, the thermodynamics are going to be better, and you can tailor the technology better to solve the problem. And this is one of the problems that we've seen a lot in manufacturing, handling in antimicrobial manufacturing and associated with waste treatment, is that they mix all their waste together from the facility, functionally diluting the fraction they want to treat, and therefore they make a process that becomes very expensive for treating the waste. So you ask, what are the best buys? The best buys are ones that tend to be decentralized, focusing on sources, and ones that are very close to where the origin of the problem, whether it's in a household, whether it's in a community, whether it's in a neighborhood, or whether it's in a small city. And the one thing I didn't say is the other really important thing, and this is something the World Health Organization has been saying for the last 5 or 6 years, is if you've got a waste, you don't put it into water unless you're ready to treat it right. Because if that waste goes into water, then you're mobilizing what's in that waste. So a pit latrine where you defecate into a pit is actually better than a septic tank sometimes, because as soon as it gets mobilized with water, all of a sudden it can then move somewhere else. So a lot of this is simply trying to improve containment. And I know that was a long answer, but that was a summary of different things you want to think about.
I see Anthony. Go ahead.
Great presentation, David. And I wondered, of course, the challenge of tackling this at the source in a decentralized way seems like almost daunting, isn't it? I mean, this is something that WHO and UNICEF have been at for quite a number of years. But you're saying, and I looked at your really interesting graphic of the cost benefit, and clearly WASH really stands out, it seems like, in terms of the return on investment. And then it seems diminishing it somewhat between primary, secondary, and tertiary, if I read it right. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
But if the number of points of actually intervention are so many more, you multiply so many more points of intervention, is it still come out, would you say, on the whole, multiplied by many points of decentralized intervention consistently, such that you should always go in upstream, close to the source? I mean, I understand the science behind what you're saying. I'm just wondering about the economics, about, so if I multiply by thousands of points sources, as opposed to, a handful downstream. For LMIC, is that making sense?
That's that's an excellent question, because we've talked about decentralization. I live in the UK, and we've been sort of thinking about the value of decentralization as a general strategy for waste management. Nothing to do with AMR. And in reality, the economics of having one big treatment plant is much better than having a whole series of decentralized treatment steps. And you would only apply decentralization to those sources that are particularly significant, and where you don't have some sort of centralization, which is you can economically connect. So we know in most places, there's so many micro sources that if you try to treat each one individually, it becomes an impossible problem. But I think what your point is, and I agree with it, is that it's really a combination. There's actually a common sense element to this, that in reality, there's some places and in some environments where some sources are so profoundly significant, treating those on a decentralized way is a really smart thing. But there is definitely economies of scale. And I think the ultimate goal is to try and have energy efficient technologies. We sort of are going to work towards energy efficient technologies at a community and a macro community scale, because that will ultimately be less expensive. But in the short term, if we want to reduce problems right now, trying to identify what those worst case sources are is really a high priority, I think.
Thanks. Really great insights.
Muso Muniere.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Very nice insights there. I just want to find out, there is a very nice take-home message, especially in terms of on-site treatments, especially for hospital wastewater treatment. Now, my question was, what happens to the wastewater, especially when you have finished and it's treated on-site? Are you going to allow it to go, or you are going to discharge the effluent on point? Because there are issues of watersheds in some countries. I want Professor Graham to shed a bit of light on what happens once you've done on-site treatment in lieu of watersheds, the effluent, because if there are multiple sites where this is being released, because I'm looking at the scenario when we had wastewater surveillance for SARS-CoV-2, which they used as an epidemiological tool. You could see that there was a very important finding which was taken from that. So I want just a bit of information on that. Thank you, Professor Graham.
Okay, the answer is, sorry. Yeah, the answer, that's an excellent question. The one thing that, and I'll sort of preface the answer with something, that every treatment process that you can use to, say, reduce AMR is not perfect. There's none that are perfect. And so even if you went ahead and said, had a community that had 5 major hospitals, and you decided as a decision in the wider community or the city that you want to deal with hospital waste separately and have pre-treatment, you've got to realize that the treatment methods you use are not going to be perfect. But they're going to be, you can definitely, I could specifically tell you how good a different technological options might be, how far you want to go, but ultimately how far you want to treat the waste depends upon what's going to happen next. So if the waste from the hospital, whether it's untreated or treated, obviously we would like to have it treated if there's no civil infrastructure and no community wastewater treatment. But if it goes in the environment, there is going to be a little bit of resistance. There's going to be a little bit of infectious disease. There's going to be a little bit going out, depending upon the scale of the treatment you've done at that local level. And so the answer is that it ultimately then comes down to, okay, as a community decision, what is the risk you're willing to take as a community? In other words, how much are you willing to allow to go out into the environment? How much natural dilution are you going to get? How much natural degradation is going to occur after the waste has been released? And those are things that we've considered for 50 years in terms of how we regulate waste going into the environment. So this isn't any really different than what we've done, say, to do with organic carbon waste or other types of waste that we've been treating for years. But ultimately, it really comes down to it's sort of like a prioritization as to how much treatment do you want. I was going to use an example because Anthony, this is a bit different, but when I was talking about decentralized versus different technologies and so forth, there's some scenarios where putting in wash is just simply not going to be good enough. There are places in the world, and I use it as an example, not for finger pointing in any way, but like Mexico City, which Mexico City really doesn't simply have enough water. And so they've got to very much rely on recycled and reused wastewater for the sake part of their water supply. And so thinking about that, say, in Mexico City, because they're so short of water, the level of treatment that's required is going to be greater before you could potentially reuse it so that you're not recirculating AMR and disease back into the water supply. So I know I didn't completely answer your question, but really ultimately there's a decision needed as to how much you're willing to accept in the environment. And this is among the greatest debates right now amongst people who do what I do, is what is good enough. But I think what I've said in the presentation today is sort of a philosophical case that you have to do what's good enough to reduce spread. And you've got to do what's most economical first. Once you've actually, say, implemented WASH, then you aspire to have secondary treatment as part of your system, as part of your local system. So that's my general thoughts. But there's kind of a policy-related decision needed there relative to the local place that wants to, how they want to prioritize their investment in terms of how much they want to put into treatment versus how much risk they're willing to have relative to the exposure that might happen downstream.
Thank you, David. Just the last question that's coming from the chat. How can you relate the burying of waste biodegradable to that of AMR?
I mean, see if I can have a look at the question and then I'll understand.
Like I can repeat that. It reads, how can you relate the burying of biodegradable waste to that of antimicrobial resistance?
Is the question referring to solid waste or fecal waste?
If our participant who posed the question, I'm just trying to find the name. If you'd like to, if possible, you can come in and perhaps explain. This is coming from Deanna Gal-Smith.
I see a hand.
Oh,
Yes,
hello?
please, we hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, my network is not too good. So I was just thinking about some other waste that environmental technician will advise that people should bury, like those biodegradable wastes. So I was thinking about from the presentation that Prof did, considering those wastes, disposing waste in the environment and leading to antimicrobial resistance. So I was just thinking, like figure waste or those waste that are biodegradable, that when you bury it and they are absorbed by the soil. So how can you relate that to the impact of antimicrobial resistance within the environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll try and keep my answer brief. When the waste that you have, say it's a human-associated waste that's got AMR bacteria and genes in it, and you want to bury it. What happens when you put something into the environment is that the environment, what we're doing is putting biological phenomena in the environment. And the environment is a massive microbial ecosystem at different scales. There's microbial ecology, there's macroecology, etc. So when you put something in the waste, if it's biodegradable, it starts degrading. The same thing is true of AMR, that if there's a bacteria that isn't adapted to a receiving environment, whether it's underground or whether it's in a surface, they just die. And as long as there's not selection for their survival, say there isn't antimicrobials or other pollutants there, they'll just slowly die. And so the reason why we want to keep our wastes from getting wet unless we're ready to treat them as wet waste is because they'll move. But once you bury something underground, there's a whole suite of microbial phenomena. There's micropredators, there are microparasites. Those are going to degrade the AMR compound, the organisms, as readily as they'll degrade anything else. And that's the reason why it's a really nice solution, as long as you do it correctly. So if you bury the waste, you've got to cover it, you've got to do different things, like say in a composting system, you have certain things you got to do and certain things you can't do. So I like burying waste, but you got to make sure that the wastes don't get below the groundwater table. They can't get exposed to water. There's certain things that you need to do to ensure that you're not going to mobilize whatever's been buried before it's had a time to degrade. And so that's all. I think that's the answer to the question. Is nature will take its course. One of the problems we've had to do with pollution in general is that we pollute places pollution by our definition is putting things in the environment beyond the carrying capacity of the environment to biodegrade them. And so if you manage this, you balance what you put in the ground, for example, with what the ground can actually normally assimilate, then you don't end up with a net negative consequence. And that same thing is true with AMR.
Great. To
Thank
close
you, Prof. Thank you so much.
on that point,
You're welcome.
thank you very much, Professor Graham. We'll be moving on now to our next segment of the session, and just to make sure we keep to our time, but we of course can continue through the chat again if you like to keep on pointing on these specific areas that have been introduced, and in particular what this means, for example, for CSO actions, as we'll really want to get to that as well tomorrow in the afternoon, the last session. So we're moving now to discuss antibiotic pollution, but from food production. And for this start of the discussion, I'd like to invite first for presentation, Rajeshri Sinha, who is in the Center for Science and Environment in India. She's a program manager with the Sustainable Food System Program. Rajeshri, thank you for being with us in your late or evening already in India, and please, you have the floor.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I
Just,
was on mute
just
possibly.
put in full
Yeah,
screen your presentation.
yes, I'll do that. Just a moment. Yeah. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk about the work in the context of the overarching discussion that we're having based on the UNEP report. And I'm going to largely talk about the antibiotic pollution from food production and largely focus on our experiences, the experiences of Center for Science and Environment in its work that it has been doing almost over a decade now from India. Okay. So here in the first slide, what I thought would be more reasonable was to capture some of the statements from the UNEP report, as it recognizes agriculture and food as one of the very important 3 key economic sectors, which we've been hearing that affect AMR in the environment, economic sector value chains. And when I went through the report in detail yesterday as I was preparing my presentation, I thought I should pick up the lines that are actually referring to how the use of antimicrobials in food production systems, if you're able to manage it, or their use as a reason towards contributing for AMR in the environment, it is something that needs to be talked about. It is something that needs to be understood, that the more we use, the more implication it is going to have on AMR, on the environmental AMR. So what is important is, like Anthony said, is to make food systems more and more sustainable. I'm not going to read out this slide, but this is just a snapshot that it talks about curbing the use of antimicrobials in animal husbandry practices, and as well resorting to approaches of biosecurity, biosafety, vaccination, and good animal husbandry programs, including alternatives, if I may add, to be able to reduce the need or dependence on antimicrobials. So the body of work that CSE has been capturing over the last decade is looking at antibiotics in different food animal production systems. Like you will see, we had looked at antibiotics in honey, in poultry, in aquaculture, in crops, in feed. In dairy, one of our most recent campaigns have been to look at antibiotic use in dairy, and one piece of important work which I'm going to focus today on is to look at something where we focused on understanding the use of critically important antimicrobials in the Indian food animal production sector. So while our previous body of work has established the use of antimicrobials, if I may add, the misuse or overuse of antimicrobials for not just for treatment, but for non-therapeutic purposes as well, but including critically important antimicrobials as well as highest priority ones. But I must also highlight here that, the list of CIAs is currently under discussion. It's being revised for the next term. But whatever I'm going to talk in this presentation will refer to the currently available finalized list from 2019. Okay. So, antibiotic use, misuse, and overuse in food systems actually can be split into two different areas, which is the therapeutic and non-therapeutic, like I've talked about. And in non-therapeutic, one of the most talked about areas is the growth promotion. It's about gaining weight for the animal with feed utilized efficiently. But on the other hand, the prevention angle, which is both prophylaxis and metaphylaxis, which caters to mass disease prevention, which is prophylaxis, and metaphylaxis, or control, which refers to when one animal in a herd is possibly ill, we register antimicrobials to save the others from contracting that illness. Now, both of these also come, according to CSC's position, both of these also fall under non-therapeutic use, but it continues to be promoted, justified, or positioned as therapeutic in many platforms. Over a period of time, our body of work has indicated that the major problem with antibiotic use can be divided into 4 different areas. One is that the misuse is very high. The use or misuse is very high. It includes critically important antimicrobials. It is being used to prevent diseases. Now, this is not real prevention. This is something which we are using to substitute as a cheap therapeutic option. So, and the last one is intensive practices are emerging, as a result of which the misuse or use of antibiotics or antimicrobials are also emerging. If I have to club them in my presentation, I would like to club the first 3 problems together and bring your attention to this latest, if not latest, the newest report of CSC, where we looked at the on-the-ground situation of critically important antimicrobials in the Indian food animal sector. However, we also did some bit of analysis on global guidances from tripartite organizations, which I'm going to touch upon very briefly. And when we looked at the dairy, poultry, and aquaculture sector, 3 of the main sectors which are relevant in the Indian context, we saw that about 27 different critically important antimicrobials were being used on the ground. For those who are listening, critically important antimicrobials are those which are categorized by the WHO as something to be, as the name suggests, critical for the purpose of treatment and needs to be conserved. And they further include highest priority critically important antimicrobials, which even demand more focus or more attention from the point of conserving them. Out of these 27, 18 antimicrobials were from 3 highest priority critically important classes, which include as of now macrolides and ketolides, the 3rd and 4th generation cephalosporins, as well as the quinolones and the fluoroquinolones. And what we saw was in these sectors, these antimicrobials were being used not just for treatment, but prevention, control, like I mentioned, even for treatment of secondary infections in case of an actual infection caused by a virus or a fungus, or even they were administered along with a poultry feed. This was mostly in case of the poultry. A very quick snapshot I wanted to present here on what are the different kinds of antibiotics we found. This is for the dairy sector. And this is for the poultry sector. This is for the aquaculture sector. I am hoping that the presentation will be shared for the ones who are interested to look. But to summarize, I will come back to this slide and I'll tell you that in dairy, 21 different critically important antimicrobials from 6 antimicrobial classes were being used, out of which 13 were highest priority ones. In the poultry sector, we saw that 14 different critically important antimicrobials were being used, out of which 8 were highest priority critically important ones. And in aquaculture, whatever was being used belonged to quinolones and fluoroquinolones, which falls under the HPCIA category. I've given some examples for you to look at. I'll now move forward. Now, We also looked at the global guidances available from the tripartite organization at the point of the study, at the point of the time when we were looking at doing this analysis. And we found that the Indian practices were kind of reflective of the collective impact of the global guidance and national policy related action. So firstly, what we saw was there was a significant overlap in antimicrobials that were being considered critical both for humans and food producing animals. The second broad observation we found was that there was a need for coherence in the position on use of critically important antimicrobials in food producing animals coming from these agencies. And thirdly, there was need for more clarity and strong action on the use of antimicrobials for disease prevention in food producing animals. So whatever the analysis was, we were able to club them under three broad findings, and definitely there was a lack of incoherence which we could see when we went into detailed analysis. If interested, I can share the link to the complete report. Apart from what I just mentioned, I also told you that the draft, the WHO list of critically important antimicrobials is currently under revision. So when we looked at it, we developed some positioning on it. We thought we should first. We thought that this was an outcome, or this was something which would cater to the work that we were doing, particularly the CIA work that I've been talking about. And at the first glance, it looked that yes, there is a lot of progress that has happened. But a detailed, quick analysis, we realized that the overall positioning of antimicrobials that needed attention, particularly the CIAs and HPCIAs, the number of antimicrobials had drastically gone down from the newest categorization, all presented in the draft that was there on the website from February 6 to February 28. And what happened in the process is the problem started appearing that it is restricted to only a very small set of antibiotics. And frequent shifts in these antimicrobials moved from HPCIA to another category, moved from CIA to another category, made it look like a less serious exercise. And also, there was limited clarity on what is expected out of this, recategorization. The basis for authorizing the antimicrobials, if you can refer to the draft, which I have not put the link here, the basis for the authorization of antimicrobials was also not clear and could potentially mislead. This is because the authorization of antimicrobials, which can be used in food animal production, can vary across countries. What is applicable in India may not be applicable in another LMIC, may not be applicable in another high-income country. And at the same time, on the ground, antimicrobial practices can vary. So on what basis, on what is the rationale of using, making these authorizations, which databases were referred, and what a country is expected to do if there is a contradiction to what a country is using or authorizing versus what is currently being proposed in the draft. All these areas need to be intervened upon. One major observation was, macrolides were pulled out of highest priority critically important antimicrobials, and so were some penicillins moved out of some critically important antimicrobials. But we thought that, this may not be a good idea because it's extensively used in the Indian food animal sector, as I just showed you, as well as in human health. And when we look at the resistance trends from India, macrolides are gradually becoming ineffective due to growing resistance. At the same time, there is confusion regarding the future use of antimicrobials authorized only for humans currently. Ideally, what should be mentioned is these antimicrobials cannot be used in food animal production going forward. So some clarity on those lines. And again, the area of crops is something we should not undermine or undervalue, which currently seems to have received less bit of attention as compared to the food animal production. I must also highlight that CSC's work in antibiotic use in crops highlighted that streptomycin was being very widely used in crop sector in India, and it's an antibiotic. It's a critically important antibiotic, and finds applications in the use of tuberculosis, treatment of tuberculosis. So from the report, these were our recommendations. But in the context of this discussion as to how environmental AMR can be managed, I think I would just like to focus on 2 or 3 things. One is use to reduce the need, to reduce the use for antimicrobials, the aspect of disease prevention, which is a component that can address a large volume of antimicrobial use. If you are able to address the disease prevention aspect, I think a lot of the antimicrobial use can be catered to and restricted. And at the same time, when I talked about alternatives, there is apart from biosecurity, hygiene, good animal husbandry practices, I think we also need to focus on the use of alternatives, because in India, which is largely dominated by small farmers, if we do not give an incentive to the farmer, if we do not give a substitute to the farmer, the farmer will not have any other option or any other way out but to resort to antimicrobials only. It is only when we are able to create systems for the farmer to be able to transform over a period of time, then we can expect such transformation of food systems happening, and that too we need to give it time. So I am trying to draw from this and also highlight another piece of work which is linked to the Indian dairy sector, is the use of ethno-veterinary medicines. Now, this is something we have been doing over the past 2 years, and we try to see this is a very traditional Ayurvedic medicine. If you have heard, Ayurveda is something which caters to traditional medicines. It also depends on homemade medicines, something which you can make at home, but it's about veterinary Ayurveda. So, and this is purely originating from India, and we were amazed to see the kind of application, the kind of use it has been having in India. So we carried out a recent assessment of National Dairy Development Board's project on ethno-veterinary medicine, which was implemented together in collaboration with the Transdisciplinary University, who were their knowledge partner. There is a mastitis control popularization project. This is a very brief snapshot. We recently released a story around this, and we are thankful to the NDDB for sharing their data to us, and we analyzed this data, and we found that till 2016, from 2016 till October 2022, or during this period of time, about 7.8 lakh disease cases, and diseases are mentioned here, which you can see in the table, across the milk unions. India largely operates in a cooperative model, particularly for milk distribution. So across 25 milk unions, nearly 8 lakh disease cases were treated, out of which the use of ethno-veterinary medicines were able to cure 80.4% of the animals who were subjected to treatment. And 9 diseases which are ideally treated with antibiotics, when subjected to the treatment by EVM, showed an 80.9% cure rate. I have highlighted the 4 major diseases, key 4 diseases, which covered 77% of these 7.8 lakh cases. And there we saw about 81.2% cure rate. So very interesting results. And what we saw, or what we could summarize, is in general, 4 out of every 5 animals were being cured by EVM. Of course, people talked about, it needs more time. It is not as quick as an antibiotic. These issues are there. But when we're talking of solutions, these are something we can take up later. But this is something which was really coming out as a real solution from the ground that has been tested and tried and that is working. Now, what do these results mean? So firstly,
apologies, can I just ask you to wrap up?
Yes, I'll be very quick. So what do these results mean? These results, of course, mean safe milk and safe milk products for the consumer, a reduction in overall treatment expenses, a reduced dependence on veterinarians, farmer independence, and improved livelihood of farmers. So, and these are 2 case studies. This is one case study from one Sabar dairy in Gujarat, where actually numbers are speaking how the use of ethno-vet medicines have helped. The other angle to this is intensification of food production practices, which in the interest of time, I'm going to limit that. The more and more we intensify, the more and more we are going to depend on use of antimicrobials and diseases. In terms of solution, I think what is important is we focus on One Health. Just yesterday, there was a quadripartite call to action for One Health. The One Health response to AMR is the action, and it has co-benefits as well. It comes with its own bit of challenges, more so for emerging economies, but this is the solution. And as LMICs, We cannot first pollute, toxify, and then clean up. We need to do things differently. And for that matter, we have to have different agendas for ourselves, which includes conserving what we have, invest in sustainable food production, looking at the environmental agenda, reducing the entry of antibiotics into the environment, and at the same time, focus on the preventive agenda. We look for options so that we are able to prevent the disease or treat the disease by other methods, so that we are able to reduce antibiotic use and their further percolation into the environment. I'm sorry that I had to hurry up in the end, but I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajeswari, and sorry to cut you. But we will be sharing the slides as you mentioned, so then others can look in more detail at the rich information you have. And I'd like just to invite participants, if you have any particular questions or clarifications or comments you'd like to make to Rajeswari. Yes, we see one. Kichfahamai Soma, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. So I'm Soma Jifamai from Burkina Faso, West Africa. And I'm very interested for your presentation. So I have some questions, but I would like to understand more. You will notice that my English is not so good because we are French country. So, but I will try to explain my idea to be clear. So my first question is to know about the, I don't know, when we say the use of antibiotic for group promotion, I don't know exactly what is it, because how can antibiotic use for group promotion? I don't understand it correctly. So I would like to get more understanding. And my second question is about your experience for fighting again antimicrobial use in the farm. Because here in Burkina, in our laboratory, we are talking about this kind of work in farmers, and we already get some financial training with self-center in order to sensitize the population in the use of antimicrobial resistance. So I would like to understand, to know more about your experience. How do you, in India, how do you do to fight against the use of or the misuse of antimicrobial? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your question. The first answer is, how is growth promotion happening? And to answer that, I think, and we have also discussed this earlier in some of our presentations, is that, there is a very thin line between growth promotion and disease prevention. So if I am administering antibiotics, in a way, I'm able to keep away diseases. I'm able to allow the animal to grow without any kind of infection, without any kind of disease, and allow a better growth. There is also something called the feed conversion ratio. And what I understand is when we are administering antibiotic-laden feed, for example, in the poultry sector, the feed conversion ratio is also enhanced. So feed conversion ratio, if you are able to understand, it's the rate at which the feed is converted within the body to something nutritious. Going beyond the very technical aspects, if I can quickly explain, is when we are administering antibiotics, the feed conversion ratio, or FCR, which every feed is supposed to have, is enhanced. There is greater feed uptake because of the greater health and greater ability to keep away diseases. And that's how the health of the animal, or most importantly, poultry. I think the growth promotion aspect largely can be linked to the poultry sector. The FCR increases. So that's how the growth promotion angle works. But I will repeat that there is a thin line between growth promotion and disease prevention, and both substantiate or both supplement each other. To your second question, if I have understood correctly, but I can ask Viviana to also repeat the question for me. But I think what he wanted to know was our experiences of working on the ground with farmers and how we are able to capture the antibiotic use from the ground. Is it that what he's been asking?
Oh, the second question is about yourself, your experience in your country.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do exactly to fight against the misuse of antibiotic in the farm?
Okay, so to answer to this is, our work has largely been policy advocacy. We do not advocate directly with the farmers on the ground, but our work has been to influence the policy eventually, so that the policy makers, when they come out with a new policy, they are able to implement this and farmers go in for a transition. We also carry out trainings and awareness programs where we invite farmers and talk to them about, the importance of going organic, the importance of going sustainable, the importance of transforming food systems. But we also understand that, this is a very small percentage of the transformation that we can bring, given the capacity, given the mandate of the organization that we work with. In a way, we directly are not influencing the farmers, but we are trying to engage with them as part of our research. We're trying to engage with them, understand their problems, pick them up from the ground, take it to the policymakers, give them the real picture, and help transform policies eventually, so that going forward, things can work in the interest of farmers. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Registrar. Just like to check if we had any other requests for the floor. I don't see any at the moment. So I think Registrar, you've really brought us with a very clear picture of some of the key issues of this excess of antimicrobial use in food production, as well as what are some of the potential strategic areas where civil society can make in ways, and with the examples of what CSE has been doing, and of course how to monitor what is antibiotic pollution from food production is always an important question, and this would be interesting as well to be able to have these spaces to also share what can be some of these tools that can be put into the hands of civil society groups or communities to be able to do better testing, for example, including on food products or water for antimicrobials or drug resistance bacteria. I think I'll just if we don't have any more questions, then Registrar, thank you so much for your presentation, and I'll just be moving on to the presentation. If we have Ricardo Matute with us, I'm not sure he is connected at the moment. So Ricardo from World Animal Protection was our planned second speaker for this session. But at the moment, if Ricardo is not here, perhaps we can go ahead just in terms of our timing and give the floor then to what will be starting our session on environment and AMR aspects with Eric Rees, who's a Safe Pharma Project Officer with Healthcare Without Harm. So Eric, if okay with you, then we'd be moving on with you in particular to hear how Healthcare Without Harm is engaging with hospitals and healthcare delivery systems for actions to curb antimicrobial resistance related pollution. Oh, we see you. Thanks, Eric.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you. Please
okay, perfect. Let me just try to find my presentation and share it with you. I will be very, very quickly. I will be very, very quick because I will need to leave in 10 minutes exactly. Actually to discuss with the MEP interest group on antimicrobial resistance. So what we are talking about right now, it's gonna be quite important for my meeting also. I just wanted to show you also the perspective of hospitals and healthcare facilities, and I will do so by first introducing myself and the organization I'm representing. I work for Healthcare Without Harm Europe, which is an organization that has a vision of a healthcare sector that does not impact negatively the environment. We do so through our 3 different programs. So the first one is Climate Smart Healthcare, which is focused on decarbonizing the healthcare sector. The second one is the Circular Healthcare, which focuses on kind of transporting the circular economy model to the healthcare sector. And the last one is the Safe Pharma, which is the one I'm working on, where we target pharmaceutical pollution and its contribution to the development of antimicrobial resistance. So we have also several networks. We have a network of global green and healthy hospitals, another network of nurses, and a network of doctors. And we are quite spread around Europe, although we are based in Brussels, but our members are in different parts of the WHO European region. That's why you see so many dots in the UK, for example, and we can see also many dots in Spain. These are our most active countries. And if you want to know more about the organization, we are organizing this conference called CleanMed, which this year has this name of changing the climate of healthcare. Unfortunately, the early bird has been already freed, so we don't have the early bird special anymore since last week, but you will be welcome to come to the conference. Just running quickly through my presentation, what I usually like to reflect when we are talking at different events is, asking people what's the main cause of the acceleration of antimicrobial resistance. So many people would say the use of antimicrobials in food production, or the people misuse in healthcare settings. Well, actually, it's a mix of everything. As all of you know, it's antimicrobial consumption. So as some of the speakers highlighted earlier, one of the most important things to reduce the acceleration of AMR is actually preventing many sectors of using antibiotics, which links also very nicely with what Anthony so presented earlier. So this is also a chart from UNEP where we can see different sources of the acceleration of antimicrobial resistance. So we can see that around 70% of antibiotics are used in animals, 30% in humans. We can see that almost up to 80%, even up to 90% of consumed antibiotics are excreted through urine and feces. There are also discharges from manufacturing sites, and also there is this big problem that wastewater treatment plants cannot remove antibiotics, which ends up with a lot of resistant bacteria that, even if they have low concentrations or not high enough to be lethal, they are sufficient to actually induce antimicrobial resistance and to accelerate it. And as I told you, we work specifically trying to help hospitals and healthcare facilities to reduce their environmental impact, which is quite high. So a question that it's I think quite relevant here is, where do pharmaceuticals end up? So the pharmaceuticals that we take. Well, between 30 and 90% of the pharmaceuticals that are orally administered are excreted into wastewater as active substances. The removal rates in wastewater plants range from 0 to 97. And so these wastewater treatment plants are primarily designed to eliminate the substances and nutrients, but are not able to completely remove pharmaceutical substances. So the question that I asked at the very beginning of this slide, where do pharmaceuticals end up? Well, most of them end up entering again the water cycle. But what's the impact of hospitals in this? So we know that between 20 and 30% of inpatients receive an antibiotic treatment during their hospital stay, which makes of hospitals high-risk point sources. We know that the proportion of resistance is usually higher in hospital wastewater than in household wastewater, which is particularly true of the last resort antimicrobials and of the highest priority critically important last resort antimicrobials, the ones that our colleague in the previous presentation talked about. And there are also some hospitals that are trying to target this issue within the hospital setting. So, for example, the Aarhus University Hospital is testing peracetic acid as a tool to neutralize the ciprofloxacin-resistant bacteria. There is still much to be done, and as I said, and as I will say, the stewardship is something quite important to reduce the environmental impact of hospitals. And something that people usually ask us is, but do health professionals know about the impact of their, for example, their prescribing practices? Well, the answer is no, surprisingly no. So in this survey that we carried out about antimicrobial resistance in European medical schools, only 22% of the respondents had in their curricula the topic related to the links between human health, animal health, and the environment, which we think it's quite low, and it's quite concerning because we need health professionals to be doing this link. So just to wrap it up a bit, I wanted to present a few measures to reduce the environmental impact of antimicrobial consumption, which has no easy effects, as you have understood already. So the first one would be improve antibiotic prescription. And as an example, we can see this hospital in the Netherlands, which I don't even dare to try to pronounce, but they reduced their prescription of last resort antibiotics by 25% and save a lot of money 1 year after introducing this stewardship program. So it's a way to go. I think it's very important that we train doctors and also other professionals that are not prescribing but are in direct contact with patients. It's also very important, obviously, to help patients to understand how important is a correct use of antibiotics. Then we think that green procurement practices are also one of the keys to this problem. So there are not many initiatives trying to green the procurement services. There are some interesting examples, for example, in Nordic countries who have been working together to try to reduce to try to green their practices and reduce their environmental footprint. Then we need also to establish protocols to safely dispose pharmaceutical waste and obviously follow them, because there are a lot of protocols that simply don't work because they are not being used. And we need also dedicated guidance for healthcare professionals on their impact on environmental health. And this is very important because, as we mentioned in the previous slide, this is not something that it's happening right now. And that's why we are doing a few things. So we have a few initiatives in place to try to address this. Just this month, we kickstarted this AMR Educare project, which will train 4,000 health professionals in 7 EU countries. This is an ambitious project because it's a project where we want really to break the barrier, and we want really to build training materials that can be adapted to the busy also schedules of doctors and that can attract their attention. So we are planning to create an app, for example, with a lot of videos, animation, podcasts, infographics, like something really that help health professionals to raise their interest on the topic. And we will train them on antimicrobial prescription, antimicrobial waste, and there will be also a module of patient empowerment, as well as a module on digital skills, because this is something that it's a weakness, strategic weakness for the European Commission. So we are including also this training on digital skills. And then we have been also producing a lot of materials in terms of recommendations to procurers. In this case, we just published a few months ago the report Procuring for Greener Pharma. It's a very simple report. We are not entering in specific products as we do, for example, in the case of climate emissions. But with this report, we want really to to encourage, let's say, our procurement officers to really start thinking about greening their procurement, because it's usually a long road, and it's not easy to get them on board. So we are trying first to make them feel comfortable with the topic, and probably we will need to put a lot of effort on not making them afraid of this, because usually greening your procurement means a lot of extra work. So we just want to make them see that it's really a simple way that will require a bit of time, but it's not going to be something very, very complicated or very, very that will change their routines. And also in the link that was shared in the chat before, you can also find some of the reports that we have written in the past. So the wastewater treatment report, or for example, the criteria for food produced with responsible antimicrobial use. And these reports, we put them at disposal of hospitals, of health professionals, really to make them start the change. So sometimes there is one professional in one hospital that starts with this antimicrobial prescribing initiative, and then this initiative gets a bit spread around the hospital. So our intention is, to start fostering change within the hospitals, and then scaling that up. I think that was pretty much everything. I'm sorry if I went really, really fast, but I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And I don't know if you have any questions. They might need to be really quick, but otherwise you can also share me on my you can also reach me on my email, and I will be happy to exchange with all of you.
Thank you, Eric. So since you suggested that you could still take one question or two very quickly, I will
one quick
call out
question.
if
Yes.
anyone else who'd like to now take the floor, and we are cognizant that we are a little bit over now our time. So thank you all for still staying with us. We'll be coming to an end shortly today, but this session will continue also tomorrow, although Eric unfortunately won't be able to join us tomorrow in the session. So if you do have a pressing question, otherwise the themes, we will continue to take them up tomorrow. But it's really important as well. I think that there's so much rich information in the reports that that healthcare without harm has been doing, as in that last slide Eric mentioned, that I think is really gives us a lot of ideas, I think, as well, of what more could be done in other settings following these experiences. I don't see any requests for the floor now, but just perhaps one very quick question to you, Eric. Does Healthcare Without Harm have guidance for cost-effective treatment of hospital pharmaceutical discharge, including in resource-limited settings, or what's the scope generally of this line of work that you've been doing? So
we don't have that guidance yet, but actually in the project that I mentioned earlier, the AMR Educare, we are planning to also build build a team around also this topic, and we are also we will be working on waste management, for example. So this is one of our natural next steps. For now, in terms of pharmaceuticals, we are just trying to make hospitals aware also of their impact and of the lack of solutions that there are right now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Eric. So colleagues, we are coming then to the end of the session now. So with that, first of all, just to thank you all, but to note that this is just the first day. So we will be continuing tomorrow. Do feel free to send us also any thoughts if you want them prior to being mentioned, for example, through the chat or elsewhere for tomorrow's session. And you have already seen in the chat that there was the link to some resources that IDEA Initiative has so kindly created to help us inform us of all the sort of important resources right now that there's out there. So if you have any other contributions that you would like to be added, just please note them as well to us by email or in chat tomorrow, and those will be included. So with that, I'll close our day for today. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you all tomorrow again at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Everyone.
Thank you.